What happens when respect becomes more valuable than life itself? When a 3-minute beating on a street corner transforms an ordinary father into something unrecognizable? On a sweltering August night in 1987, the answer to that question would paint Detroit's East Side red with blood and leave 9 families forever broken. If you think you understand the limits of human vengeance, this story will challenge everything you believe about justice, family, and the thin line between protecting what you love and becoming the very monster you're fighting against. But I warn you, what you're about to hear contains graphic violence based on real events that shocked even hardened detectives. Detroit in the summer of 1987 wasn't just a city struggling with economic collapse. It was a war zone where entire neighborhoods had been abandoned to decay, where the crack epidemic had turned streets into battlegrounds, and where respect wasn't just important, it was the only currency that mattered when everything else had been stripped away. The air hung thick with humidity that August, trapping the smell of industrial decay, and something else residents never spoke about, but always noticed. Temperatures climbed into the 90s during the day, and even at midnight, you could feel the concrete radiating heat back into the darkness. This was a place where sirens had become background music, and where the sound of gunfire was often dismissed as firecrackers. Marcus Williams understood this world better than most. At 43, he carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who had served his country in Vietnam and worked honest jobs for 2 decades. His weathered hands told the story of years spent on assembly lines at the Chrysler plant, building cars that rolled off to suburban driveways he'd never see. When the layoffs came in 1982, those same hands found work wherever they could, fixing water heaters, moving furniture, doing security at nightclubs, where younger men made their living in ways Marcus refused to consider. The house on Milliland Street where Marcus raised his 3 sons was small but immaculate. While half the houses on his block sat empty with broken windows and overgrown yards, Marcus kept his lawn cut and his shutters straight. Pride mattered to him. It was one of the few things left that money couldn't buy and circumstances couldn't take away. Every morning began the same way. Coffee in the same percolator his wife Brenda had bought at Hudson's department store years earlier. 1 cigarette while reading the Detroit Free Press at the kitchen table. Then he'd wake Jerome, Curtis and Antoine for whatever work they'd managed to find, legitimate or otherwise. Brenda had been everything that kept Marcus anchored to the world of decent men. She'd worked at Michigan Bell, bringing home a steady paycheck that kept their small family afloat during the lean years. When she started complaining about being tired all the time in March of 1985, neither of them imagined it would lead to a diagnosis that would change everything. Stage 4 ovarian cancer took her 8 months later, and with her went Marcus's connection to the version of himself that believed in rules, law, and the possibility that hard work could build something lasting. What Marcus valued most wasn't material wealth, which he'd never had anyway. What mattered was the idea that a man could work hard, raise his sons right, and build something that would endure. By 1987, that idea was barely surviving. Without Brenda's income, the family was drowning financially. The house payment was 3 months behind, and Marcus scrambled for whatever work he could find. But somehow, Marcus had managed to keep all 3 of his sons away from the drug trade that consumed so many young men in their neighborhood. In a place where 14-year-olds were running crack for crews that made more money in a week than Marcus made in a month, he'd kept his boys clean. That took more than vigilance. It took the kind of respect that came from being known as a solid man, a Vietnam veteran who didn't start trouble, but wouldn't back down from it either. The neighborhood knew Marcus Williams. They knew he'd done his time in service, knew he'd worked the plant for 13 years, knew he was raising 3 sons alone after cancer took his wife. They knew he was struggling, but handling it with dignity. That respect was everything to Marcus. It was all he had left to give his sons, the only inheritance he could pass down in a world that had taken everything else. On the other side of the economic divide that split Detroit's east side were young men like Dwayne Harris. At 27, Dwayne controlled several street corners along the Grasset Avenue corridor, managing a crew of about 15 guys who moved product, collected money, and enforced territory. He wasn't operating at the level of the major organizations that controlled millions of dollars in daily trade. But he had built something substantial enough to support not just himself but his sick mother and younger siblings. Dwayne drove a spotless burgundy Oldsmobile Cutlass Supreme and saw his 3-year-old daughter Jasmine every Sunday, always bringing presents. He had dreams of saving enough money to get out of the game and maybe open a legitimate garage. He was good with cars and smart enough to know the streets wouldn't let him grow old. Among Dwayne's crew were young men whose names would soon be written in a spiral notebook and marked for death. Kevin Thompson, 22, solid and reliable with a daughter of his own. Terrence Mitchell, 25, who handled collections and dreamed of moving to Atlanta. Ronald Harris, Dwayne's 19-year-old brother, enrolled at Wayne County Community College, trying to study auto mechanics. Andre Simmons and Darius Coleman, both in their mid-20s, trying to balance street life with legitimate ambitions. These weren't career criminals in the traditional sense. Most were like Dwayne himself, young men who'd grown up watching factories close, watching their fathers lose jobs, watching their neighborhoods empty out and fall apart. The crack trade hadn't created broken communities in Detroit. It had filled the vacuum that economic collapse had left behind. For years, Marcus Williams and Dwayne Harris had coexisted in the same East Side world without significant conflict. They knew each other by sight and reputation. Marcus sometimes worked security at clubs where Dwayne and his crew would appear. They'd nod to each other with the mutual respect that existed between an older generation and a younger one. Marcus didn't approve of what Dwayne did, but he understood it. And Dwayne respected that Marcus was keeping his sons clean in a world that made that nearly impossible. That fragile balance would shatter on Thursday night, August 13th, when the temperature had finally dropped to 81 degrees and Marcus was walking home from a handyman job where he'd fixed a broken water heater for $75 cash. He wore his old Chrysler plant jacket, navy blue with his name stitched over the pocket, and carried a small toolbox. His right leg was bothering him from an old injury, and he was looking forward to getting home, maybe having a beer and watching the Tigers game if it was still on. At the corner of Grasset and Fairmount, Dwayne Harris and 6 members of his crew were standing outside a liquor store that stayed open until 11. They'd been drinking, smoking, conducting business. One of them, a kid named Brandon who was maybe 19, bumped into Marcus as he walked past. What happened next would be witnessed by 37 people, and not one of them would intervene. Brandon said something about watching where he was going, called Marcus an old man. Marcus stopped, turned, looked at the kid. He said Brandon had bumped into him, just wanted acknowledgement of the fact. That should have been the end of it. A small moment, minor disrespect, easily resolved. But Brandon was showing off for the crew, and Dwayne, who'd had too much to drink, made a decision he would spend the rest of his life regretting. The words that came out of Dwayne's mouth that night would echo through the streets for decades. He laughed, said something cruel about Marcus being washed up, a has-been from the plant, a man who couldn't even keep his wife alive. The insult was calculated to cut deep, and it found its mark with surgical precision. Marcus's face changed. Something shifted behind his eyes, something cold and final. He dropped his toolbox and took a step toward Dwayne. What happened next lasted exactly 3 minutes, but those 180 seconds would reshape the lives of dozens of families and leave scars on Detroit's east side that would never fully heal. 6 young men in their 20s descended on one 43-year-old man. They knocked Marcus to the pavement, kicked him in the ribs, the back, the face. Someone took his wallet. Someone else took his wedding ring, the gold band he'd never removed since Brenda died 2 years earlier. 37 people watched from windows, from cars, from the sidewalk. Not one person intervened. That wasn't how survival worked in that neighborhood in that year. When they were finished, Marcus lay bleeding on the concrete at Grasset and Fairmount. Blood ran from his nose and mouth. His left eye was already swelling shut. He could hear Dwayne's voice somewhere above him, telling him his time was done, that he didn't walk these streets like he owned them anymore. Marcus lay there for maybe 60 seconds after they walked away. Then he pushed himself to his hands and knees, then to his feet. He retrieved his toolbox and started the slow, painful walk back to his house on Mullen Street, blood dripping onto the front of his Chrysler jacket. His oldest son, Jerome, was sitting on the front porch when Marcus came up the steps at 10:17 that night. Jerome took one look at his father's battered face and started to stand. Marcus held up a hand and said 5 words that would change everything. "Get your brothers." Kitchen table. 5 minutes. Jerome saw something in his father's eyes he'd never seen before. Not anger exactly, but something colder, more calculating. He went inside to wake Curtis and Antoine, while Marcus stood alone on his front porch, touching his face gently and feeling the damage. His wedding ring was gone. Brenda's ring, the one connection he'd kept to the woman who'd made him promise to keep their sons safe. Inside the house, at the kitchen table where the family had shared thousands of meals, Marcus told his 3 sons what had happened. He described the beating, the humiliation, the 37 witnesses who'd done nothing. He told them about the wedding ring. Then he told them what was going to happen next. Jerome, 24 years old, started to object. He talked about police, about law, about other ways to handle the situation. Marcus just looked at him with those cold eyes and asked a simple question. "If I let this stand, what am I teaching you? That a man can be beaten in the street like a dog and do nothing? That your father's respect means nothing?" Curtis, 21 and quieter than his brothers, asked what his father needed them to do. Antoine, 18 and still soft around the edges, didn't say anything at all. He just nodded. What Marcus Williams didn't understand as he sat at that kitchen table with his 3 sons in the early hours of August 14th was that his decision would set in motion a chain of events that would leave 9 young men dead and 4 members of his own family either killed or imprisoned for life. He was about to transform from Marcus Anthony Williams, Vietnam veteran and devoted father, into something else entirely. The next morning, Marcus couldn't sleep. His ribs ached where they'd kicked him. His left eye had swollen completely shut. He lay in the bed he'd shared with Brenda for 23 years, staring at the ceiling and running his thumb over the place where his wedding ring used to be. At 3:30 in the morning, Marcus got up, made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table with a spiral notebook. The same kind Brenda used to use for grocery lists. He wrote 9 names: Dwayne Richard Harris, Kevin Jerome Thompson, Terrence Mitchell, Brandon Lewis, Ronald Harris, Andre Simmons, Darius Coleman, Jerome Washington. Each name represented a life that would end because of what had happened on that street corner. Marcus stared at those names for a long time. These weren't strangers. He knew some of their families, had grown up in the same neighborhoods. In another version of Detroit, the one that had died with the auto plants, some of these young men might have worked alongside him at Chrysler, might have been his son's friends. But that Detroit was gone. This was the Detroit that remained, where 37 people could watch a man get beaten and do nothing. When Jerome came into the kitchen at 5:45 and found his father at the table with the notebook, he asked if Marcus was sure about what he was planning. Marcus looked up at his oldest son and saw Brenda's eyes looking back at him, worried and gentle. He explained that Antoine was 18, the same age as some of the boys who'd beaten him. If he let them get away with what they'd done, what would happen the next time Antoine walked past them? What would happen to Curtis? What would happen to Jerome himself? Jerome suggested they could go to the police. Marcus laughed bitterly. The police had their own problems and weren't coming to the east side to investigate a street corner beating. Jerome suggested they could leave, move somewhere else, start over. Marcus asked with what money, and where could they go that wouldn't carry this shame with them? Over the next 2 days, Friday and Saturday, the Williams family gathered intelligence. Curtis talked to people he knew on the streets, people who owed him small favors, people who'd seen what happened to Marcus and felt some kind of way about it. Jerome drove around the east side, noting addresses, watching routines, studying patterns of movement. Meanwhile, the men whose names were written in that spiral notebook went about their normal lives, completely unaware that someone was coming for them. Dwayne Harris helped his diabetic mother with groceries. Kevin Thompson worked at a mechanic shop during the day and dreamed of going back to school. Terrence Mitchell saved money hoping to move to Atlanta and start fresh somewhere the streets didn't own him. Marcus needed weapons. He still had his old service pistol from Vietnam, wrapped in oiled cloth in the back of his closet. But one handgun wouldn't be enough for what he was planning. On Saturday evening, he drove across the city to visit a man who dealt in firearms outside the legal system. For $320, everything he'd saved from the last 2 weeks of work, Marcus acquired 2 additional weapons and enough ammunition to end 9 lives. That Sunday, while the Williams family finalized their plans, Dwayne Harris attended his daughter Jasmine's 3rd birthday party. Small backyard, kiddie pool, hamburgers on a charcoal grill. Jasmine wore a pink dress and had frosting smeared across her face. Dwayne held his daughter, both of them laughing as she tried to feed him cake with her tiny hands. None of the crew members who attended that party had any idea that someone had written their names in a notebook and was planning to cross each one off permanently. Sunday night, August 16th, Marcus Williams sat alone in his living room after his sons had gone to sleep. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and distant sirens somewhere deeper in the east side. He looked at photographs on the wall. His wedding day in 1962, Brenda holding baby Jerome at the hospital, the boys at various ages, birthday parties, school photos. Marcus knew what he was about to do would erase all of that, would transform him from a decent man into something else entirely. But in the economy of respect that governed the East Side in 1987, you either responded to disrespect or became prey. There was no middle ground, no peaceful resolution. At 2:30 in the morning on what would become the bloodiest night in East Side Detroit since the riots of 1967, Marcus walked quietly to his bedroom. He picked up his service pistol, checked the magazine, and chambered a round. The familiar weight felt right in his hand. Muscle memory from a different war in a different place. At 3 in the morning, Marcus woke his sons. They dressed in dark clothes, distributed the weapons, and reviewed the addresses one final time. Jerome tried once more to stop what was about to happen, telling his father they couldn't take it back once it was done. Marcus looked at his oldest son and said something that would haunt them all. "We're already gone, son. We left Thursday night on that corner. What we're doing now is just finishing what they started." At 4 in the morning on Sunday, August 16th, 1987, 4 men left the house on Mellon Street, carrying loaded weapons and a conviction harder than Detroit concrete. What happened in the next 72 hours would leave 9 young men dead and mark the East Side forever as the place where honor and violence collided in the unforgiving streets of a dying city. The hunt was about to begin. The city slept fitfully that night, unaware that death was moving through its streets with methodical precision. At 11:52 that Sunday evening, Kevin Thompson stepped out of his mother's house on Chalmers Street, pulling the security gate closed behind him. 22 years old, wearing a Detroit Pistons jersey, heading to his Monte Carlo parked at the curb. He had plans to meet someone, probably would have been back within the hour. He saw Marcus standing on the sidewalk 10 feet away, and recognition flickered across his face. Started to say something. The shot from Marcus's .45 cut through the humid night air like thunder. Kevin fell backward against the security gate, the sound echoing down the street and bouncing off brick houses and empty lots. Marcus stood there, weapon still raised, looking at the first body. The first name crossed off his list. He waited for guilt, for horror, for something human to wash over him. Instead, he felt nothing but cold satisfaction that it had finally started. Inside the house, someone screamed. Lights came on. Marcus was already moving back to the car where Jerome, Curtis and Antoine waited in stunned silence. 25 minutes later, they found Terrence Mitchell at an after-hours spot on 7 Mile Road, the basement club where people went to drink and conduct business when legitimate establishments closed for the night. Bass-heavy music rattled the windows, covering the sound of 4 men entering through the back door. Terrence was at the bar, laughing with 2 women, Corona in hand. 25 years old, had been saving money for 2 years to move to Atlanta and start fresh somewhere the streets didn't own him. He'd hidden $3,400 in his mother's basement, wrapped in plastic inside a heating duct. Money that would never be spent. He turned and saw Marcus Williams coming through the crowd. The laughter died on his face as understanding replaced it. Quick calculation of distances, exits, chances. He tried to speak, tried to explain. Marcus raised the weapon and people scattered, screaming, pushing toward doors. Terence tried to move behind the bar, but Jerome and Curtis blocked that path. Nowhere to run in a basement with 40 people suddenly fighting for 2 exits. Marcus told him he'd been there Thursday night, that he'd watched. Terence swore he hadn't touched Marcus, but Marcus's response was simple and final. Watching was enough. The shot sent Terence falling behind the bar, bottles shattering around him. Marcus walked back out through the chaos. Nobody stopped him. Nobody called the police. Not in that neighborhood, not for that kind of business. The code of the street worked both ways. 3 miles away, Dwayne Harris lay in bed next to his girlfriend, Kesha, their daughter Jasmine, sleeping in the next room. He couldn't sleep, kept thinking about that old man he'd beaten on Thursday. Something about it didn't sit right. The man's eyes when he was down hadn't shown fear. They'd shown something colder, something calculating. Dwayne got up, walked to the window, looked out at the quiet street. Everything appeared normal. He went back to bed and closed his eyes, completely unaware that 2 of his crew members were already dead. At 12:44, they reached Brandon Lewis. The 19-year-old lived with his grandmother on Mulholland Street, just 3 blocks from Marcus's own house. Marcus had known Miss Evelyn Lewis for 20 years. She'd brought him a casserole when Brenda died, had told him she was praying for his family. Now Marcus sat in his car looking at her house, knowing her grandson was inside. The kid who'd started it all by bumping into him. Antoine spoke from the back seat, his voice small and uncertain, pointing out that it was Miss Evelyn's house. She was good people who'd brought them food after their mother died. Jerome suggested they could skip this one, move on to the next name. But Marcus sat there for 5 long minutes, the longest 5 minutes of the night. He thought about Miss Evelyn's kindness, about innocent people caught in violence they didn't deserve. But Brandon wasn't innocent. Brandon had been there, had laughed, had participated. When Brandon finally left the house at 1:10, moving quietly so he wouldn't wake his grandmother, they took him 2 blocks away in an empty lot, where abandoned cars rusted under the Detroit sky. It was quick and professional. Brandon never saw it coming. Marcus walked back to the car and looked at his hands holding the weapon. These hands had held his newborn sons, had changed diapers and tied shoes, had held Brenda's hand through 23 years of marriage. Now they were a killer's hands. The transformation was complete. By 1:38, they'd eliminated 4 people. 5 names remained on Marcus's list, but dawn was approaching. The city would wake up soon and police would start connecting the dots. Time was running short. Jerome suggested they split up to cover more ground, but Marcus refused. They would stay together and do this right. When Jerome pointed out that nothing about what they were doing was right, Marcus looked at his 3 sons, all of them now carrying blood on their hands, all of them changed forever. He wanted to tell them he was sorry, wanted to explain that this was the only way, wanted to say something that would make sense of the madness. But there was nothing to say. They'd crossed the line together. Now they had to finish it together. At 2:15, they found Andre Simmons sitting on his front steps, smoking a cigarette and checking his pager. 23 years old, rented the upper flat, worked part-time at a car wash, trying to make legitimate money to supplement what he earned on the streets. When he saw Marcus getting out of the car, he stood slowly with his hands raised. Andre knew what this was about, said what happened Thursday was wrong. Asked why Marcus hadn't stopped it if he knew it was wrong. Andre explained he wasn't there for most of it, that by the time he came out of the store, Marcus was already down. He swore on his mother's life that he hadn't touched him. Marcus walked closer, weapon hanging at his side. He pointed out that Andre had been there, had seen it happen. When Andre asked what he was supposed to do, jump in and get beaten down too, Marcus's response cut through the night air like a blade. 37 people saw, and not one stopped it. Andre's voice rose as he explained he had a little sister he was trying to keep in school, a mother with bills to pay. He couldn't afford to make enemies on the street. Marcus raised his weapon and delivered a truth as cold as winter. Everyone makes choices. And that night, Andre had made his. The shot echoed through the pre-dawn darkness. Andre fell backward on his own front steps, while his pager continued flashing with codes that would never be answered. At 2:47, Jerome and Marcus's nephew, Lamar, found Darius Coleman at his house on Harper Avenue. 26 years old, the oldest of Dwayne's regular crew, had been trying to get out of the game for 2 years, but kept getting pulled back by bills and responsibilities. When Darius opened his door, Jerome raised his weapon before the man could speak. Darius looked at the gun, looked at Jerome's face, recognized him as Marcus Williams's oldest son. Understanding came quickly. Darius said Marcus was making a huge mistake, that this wasn't the way to handle things. Jerome reminded him that Thursday night on Grasset Avenue, half the East Side had watched his father get beaten. Was Marcus supposed to eliminate half the city? Just the 9 who put their hands on his father, Jerome replied. Just the 9 who took his respect like it was nothing. Darius stepped back, mentioned his 8-year-old daughter, who had nobody else but him. Jerome's hand shook for the first time that night, as hesitation crept in. An 8-year-old daughter, the same age his cousin had been when everything started falling apart for their family. Lamar stepped forward and took the weapon from Jerome's trembling hand. Jerome protested, but Lamar didn't wait. The shot echoed through Harper Avenue, and Darius fell across his threshold, half inside and half outside his house. 3 names remained. 3 young men who at that moment were still alive, completely unaware that death was hunting them through the streets of Detroit. At 3:15, they found Jerome Washington at a house on Mack Avenue where he sometimes stayed with his girlfriend. 21 years old, medium build, scar over his left eye from a bottle fight 2 years earlier. He came out heading to his car, probably had gotten word that something was happening and was trying to reach safety. He saw 4 men waiting by his car and ran. Made it half a block before Curtis caught him in an empty lot between 2 abandoned houses. Curtis had played football in high school and still had that speed when he needed it. Jerome gasped for breath, hands raised, saying he knew what this was about, but asking them to listen. Thursday was Dwayne's call, he explained. They just followed orders. That's how it worked on the streets. When the man said jump, you jumped. Curtis's voice was cold as winter when he responded that Marcus had asked for respect and gotten a beating instead. That wasn't following orders. That was a choice. Jerome apologized, asked what they wanted him to say. Curtis told him that sorry didn't give his father his wedding ring back, didn't erase 37 witnesses. When Jerome tried to run again, Antoine grabbed him. The kid was small, maybe 140 pounds, reminded Antoine of himself just a few years earlier. Jerome whispered that he was 21, the same age as Antoine. They were the same, he pleaded. Antoine looked at Curtis and something passed between them. A moment of shared understanding that what they were doing was wrong, irreversible, would haunt them forever. But they did it anyway. The shot rang out and Jerome fell in the empty lot, surrounded by broken glass and weeds growing through cracked concrete. Antoine threw up in the corner, his body finally rebelling against what his mind had accepted. Marcus found them there 5 minutes later. 2 names remained on his list: Dwayne's younger brother Ronald and Dwayne himself. Curtis pointed out that Ronald wasn't even there Thursday night. He was 19, still in school, trying to get out of the life that had claimed his older brother. Marcus stood in that empty lot, surrounded by his sons and nephew, all of them covered in moral contamination that would never wash clean. The line had been crossed hours ago, but was there a line even further? Was there a point where you stopped being a man seeking justice and became just another monster? Ronald gets a pass, Marcus said finally. But Dwayne doesn't. Dwayne answers for all of it. At 4:02 in the morning, they found Dwayne Harris exactly where Marcus knew he'd be, at his mother's house on Mack Avenue, Patricia Harris's modest brick home with its well-kept lawn and Virgin Mary statue in the front yard. Dwayne's burgundy Cutlass Supreme sat in the driveway, gleaming even in the pre-dawn darkness. Marcus knocked on the door, and Patricia Harris answered, hair wrapped in a scarf, bathrobe pulled tight. 52 years old with tired eyes and hands swollen from years of nursing work. She looked at Marcus, looked at the weapon, and understood immediately. She told him her son wasn't there, but Marcus knew better. Patricia closed her eyes, and when she opened them, tears ran down her face. She told him Dwayne was at Connor Avenue, at his girlfriend's place. But she pleaded with him to remember that Dwayne had a 3-year-old daughter. If Marcus took her daddy, he'd be destroying that innocent child. Marcus looked at this woman he'd known for 10 years, who'd always been kind, who'd raised her children as best she could in a city that offered few choices. He told her that Thursday night, her son had destroyed his family. All he was doing was balancing the scales. The final confrontation was about to begin, and in the apartment on Connor Avenue, where a 3-year-old girl slept peacefully, completely unaware that her world was about to change forever, the last act of this bloody drama would test the very limits of human vengeance. Dawn was still 3 hours away, but the sky had that quality that suggested the faintest shift from absolute black to something lighter. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster crowed and a dog barked. Life continuing, indifferent to death. The hunt was almost over, but the most difficult choice still lay ahead. Ahead, at 4:31 in the morning, Marcus climbed the stairs to Kesha's second-floor apartment alone. The stairwell reeked of urine and mildew, gang tags spray-painted on walls, where a light fixture hung by exposed wires. His sons waited below as backup, witnesses to what would be the final act of this night of vengeance. He knocked on apartment 2C, waited, knocked again, harder this time. The door opened, and Dwayne Harris stood there in a white t-shirt and basketball shorts, sleep still clouding his eyes. Then he saw Marcus, saw the weapon, and sleep vanished instantly. They looked at each other across the threshold. Two men separated by 17 years, but connected forever by Thursday night on Grasset Avenue. Connected by a 3-minute beating that had spiraled into this moment of reckoning. Dwayne said it wasn't a question that Marcus had killed his crew. Marcus confirmed all of them except Ronald, who hadn't been there that night. When Dwayne called the whole thing insane, Marcus corrected him. 8 people dead over respect. Over 37 people watching a man get beaten and doing nothing. Over taking his wife's wedding ring like it meant nothing. Dwayne's jaw tightened as he admitted Brandon had taken the ring, that he'd made him give it back. Marcus asked where it was now. In his car's glove compartment, Dwayne replied. He'd been planning to return it, but the words trailed off as he realized how meaningless that gesture had become. Behind Dwayne, Marcus could hear the sounds of life continuing. Cartoons playing on a television. A child's voice asking who was at the door. Jasmine, 3 years old, about to lose her father if Marcus pulled that trigger. Marcus's finger tightened on the weapon. This was it, the final name on his list. The man who'd started it all with his cruel words and vicious laughter. When Marcus asked if he had a daughter, Dwayne's voice cracked as he described Jasmine. 3 years old, loved Sesame Street and chicken nuggets, thought her daddy was a superhero. She didn't know what he did for a living or what kind of man he really was. She just knew he was her daddy. Marcus told him about Brenda, 23 years of marriage, 8 months fighting cancer before it claimed her. That ring Dwayne had taken was the last piece of her Marcus had left, the only connection to the woman who'd made him promise to keep their sons safe. They stood there in that doorway, both men with their reasons, both with people they loved, both trapped in a cycle of violence that Detroit had created and normalized. Dwayne said this didn't have to happen, that Marcus had made his point. 8 dead was more than enough. The whole city would know not to mess with him. But Marcus had always finished what he started. Dwayne pointed out that would mean his daughter growing up without a father, just like Marcus's sons had almost grown up without theirs when he was overseas. Marcus knew exactly what that felt like. 13 months in Vietnam, while Jerome and Curtis were babies, while Brenda raised them alone. He'd missed first steps, first words, first everything. For the first time that night, Genuine doubt crept into Marcus's mind. His hand actually shook as he held the weapon. Then Jasmine appeared behind Dwayne's legs, rubbing sleep from her eyes. Small and innocent, wearing purple pajamas with cartoon characters. She asked who the man was with the simple curiosity of a child who'd never known danger. Dwayne picked up his daughter, held her against his chest, looked at Marcus with tears streaming down his face. He begged Marcus not to do this in front of her, not to let a 3-year-old watch her father die. Marcus stood there, weapon raised, looking at a child who could have been his own granddaughter. He thought about legacy, about what kind of man kills a father in front of his child, about lines that once crossed destroy whatever humanity remains in a person. He lowered the weapon. The words that came out of his mouth surprised even him. "Go get the ring from your car and bring it to me." Dwayne's eyes widened in disbelief. Was Marcus serious? "Get it now," Marcus said, "before I change my mind." Dwayne handed Jasmine to Kesha inside the apartment and ran down to his car. 2 minutes later, he returned with a gold wedding band and placed it in Marcus's palm. Marcus examined it, found the inscription he'd had engraved in 1962, M+B forever. He slipped it onto his finger where it belonged, but Marcus made it clear this didn't make them even. 8 of Dwayne's crew were dead. Dwayne was alive only because of his daughter, not because he deserved mercy. If Marcus ever saw him on Grasset Avenue again, if he ever saw Dwayne or any of his people near him or his sons, he would finish what he'd started that night. "Crystal clear," Dwayne replied. Marcus turned and started down the stairs. He'd made it 3 steps when Dwayne called out to him. Marcus stopped but didn't turn around. Dwayne said Thursday night had been wrong, what they'd done to him. He'd known it was wrong even while it was happening. He was sorry. Marcus continued down the stairs without responding. What was there to say? Sorry didn't bring back 8 young men. Sorry didn't erase the blood on everyone's hands. Sorry was just a word people said when the damage was already done and could never be undone. At 5:17 in the morning, the sun was beginning to rise over Detroit, turning the sky from black to grey to the faintest suggestion of pink. Marcus sat in his Buick with his sons and nephew, all of them silent. The killing was finished. 8 men eliminated over 6 hours in what would become the bloodiest night in East Side Detroit since the riots of 1967. Marcus looked at his hands. Brenda's ring was back on his finger where it belonged, but these hands that had held his sons, that had worked assembly lines, that had built a life, were now a killer's hands. The void where emotions should have been had become absolute. Jerome asked quietly what they should do now. Marcus stared at the dawn breaking over the city, the same sun that had risen over Vietnam, over the Chrysler plant, over Brenda's grave at Elmwood Cemetery, the same sun that would continue to shine on Detroit whether they lived or died, whether they were heroes or monsters. They would go home, Marcus said, wash up, wait for the police to come, and then face what they had done. Marcus started the engine, and the transmission slipped between gears as they drove through streets that would soon be crawling with police cars and crime scene tape. 4 men who had crossed a line no human being should cross, carrying the weight of 8 dead, and knowing they would carry it for the rest of their lives. The blood had been shed. The debt had been paid. And in a few hours, when terrified witnesses began calling 911 about bodies scattered across the East Side, Detroit would wake to discover what happens when ordinary men are pushed past their limits in a city that has forgotten how to protect its own. 9 hours after the last shot was fired, at 2:17 in the afternoon on Sunday, August 17th, Miss Evelyn Lewis walked to her corner store like she did every afternoon. 71 years old, moving slow because of arthritis, carrying her shopping bag and church bulletin. She was thinking about making potato salad for dinner and worrying about her grandson Brandon, who'd come home late the night before and left early that morning without saying where he was going. The cashier at the store looked strange when she entered, pale and shaken. He told her carefully that she should go home and lock her doors. When she asked why, he could only say that people were dead. Many people. Police were everywhere on Chalmers Street, on 7 Mile, on Harper Avenue. Miss Evelyn walked back to her house faster than her knees wanted to allow and found 2 Detroit police cruisers parked in front. Officers stood on her porch, one holding his hat in his hands the way they do when bringing the worst possible news. They asked if she was Evelyn Lewis, if Brandon Lewis was her grandson. Ice formed in her chest as she confirmed both facts. The young officer, maybe 26 and black like her grandson, looked at his partner before delivering words that would destroy everything she knew about her world. Brandon had been found dead that morning. They believed he was the victim of a homicide. Miss Evelyn heard the words, but they didn't make sense. Her grandson, the boy she'd raised after his mother ran off, the boy who'd eaten breakfast at her table just yesterday morning. She insisted they were wrong, that he was probably just sleeping somewhere like he sometimes did. But they weren't wrong. And by 3 that afternoon, as news spread through the east side like wildfire, 7 more families would receive similar visits from officers standing on porches, with hats in hands, speaking words that would shatter entire worlds. Detective William Henderson arrived at the first crime scene on Chalmers Street at 4:30 that afternoon. 48 years old, 22 years with Detroit police, 7 years working homicide. He'd seen plenty of bodies in his career, but walking up to Kevin Thompson's mother's house and seeing the crime scene tape, something about this felt different. The scene told a clear story. Single shot, close range, professional execution. The victim never had time to draw his own weapon, a .38 revolver found unfired in his waistband. No signs of struggle, just death delivered with military precision. Detective Henderson interviewed Kevin's mother, Gloria Thompson, who sat at her kitchen table surrounded by photos of her son. As a baby, at high school graduation, holding his own daughter. She told the detective that Kevin had been trying to change his life, working at a mechanic shop during the day, saving money to go back to school. When Henderson asked if Kevin had any enemies, anyone who might want to hurt him, Gloria looked at him with eyes that had seen too much loss. She asked if he wanted to know who did this. When he said yes, she gave him a name that would crack the case wide open. Marcus Williams and his boys. Everyone on the east side knew it. The Vietnam veteran who lived on Millerland Street. Thursday night, Dwayne's crew had beaten him on Grasset Avenue and taken his wedding ring. Marcus had decided to make them pay for it. By 6 that evening, reports had come in from 6 more locations scattered across the east side. Bodies at every location, all shot, all members of the same crew, all killed within a 6-hour window. Lieutenant Raymond Cooper, head of the Major Crimes Unit, looked at the map with 8 red pins marking 8 deaths and understood immediately this wasn't random gang violence. This was systematic, planned, executed with military precision. When he learned Marcus Williams had served in Vietnam with distinction, the pattern became clear. This was a man who knew how to plan an operation and execute it flawlessly. The timeline was devastating in its efficiency. 11:50 at night until approximately 5 in the morning. Multiple shooters, multiple calibers, all fired within the established window. Marcus Williams and his 3 sons had waged their own private war against the crew that had humiliated their patriarch. But there was a 9th target who had survived. Dwayne Harris himself was alive and willing to talk. In interview room 3 at the 5th precinct, Dwayne sat with his daughter Jasmine on his lap and his girlfriend Kesha beside him. He looked like he'd aged 10 years overnight. Detective Henderson sat across from them, recorder running, but this wasn't really an interrogation. This was a man who'd watched his entire crew get eliminated and now had to decide whether to cooperate with the law or protect the man who'd spared him. Dwayne described how Marcus Williams had come to his door at 4:30 that morning with a weapon, saying he'd eliminated the whole crew and that Dwayne was the last name on his list. When Henderson asked why Marcus hadn't killed him too, Dwayne's voice cracked as he explained that Jasmine had come to the door and Marcus couldn't do it in front of a 3-year-old child. When Henderson asked if Dwayne would testify, the young man's anger flared briefly. Marcus had killed 8 of his people, men he'd grown up with, brothers in everything but blood. But then he looked at Jasmine again, and his voice softened. Marcus had let him live, had let him stay with his daughter when he didn't have to. So yes, he would testify, but not for the police, for the boys who deserved justice, and for the man who'd shown mercy when mercy wasn't expected. By Monday morning, the news had exploded across Detroit like wildfire. 8 dead in what the media dubbed the East Side Massacre. Television crews set up outside the police station and in the neighborhood where it happened. The Detroit Free Press ran headlines about family vengeance, leaving 8 young men dead. The community split down the middle in their reactions. Some called Marcus Williams a monster who'd murdered young men in cold blood. Others said he was a desperate father driven to extreme measures by disrespect that couldn't be allowed to stand. At Greater Bethlehem Temple, where the Williams family had attended services every Sunday, Reverend Samuel Jackson struggled through his sermon asking why this violence had happened, why neighbors couldn't solve their disputes without bloodshed. He had no answers, only grief and the terrible knowledge that his congregation included both the Williams family and families of the victims. On the streets, conversations grew heated. At barbershops and carryouts and basketball courts, people debated whether Marcus had been justified. Some understood the code that demanded response to such humiliation. Others saw only senseless murder that had destroyed multiple families. The arrest came at 6 in the morning on Tuesday, August 18th. 8 officers approached the house on Mulellen Street, expecting armed resistance from men who'd already demonstrated their willingness to use lethal force. What they found was Marcus Williams sitting calmly on his front porch, unarmed, hands visible on his knees. His 3 sons stood behind him, also unarmed, also calm. No weapons in sight, no defensive positions, just 4 men who'd crossed a line and were ready to face the consequences with the same stoic acceptance mountain people bring to all of life's harsh realities. Detective Henderson walked slowly up the cracked concrete walkway to the porch, where he'd sometimes seen Marcus working on his lawnmower or sitting with his late wife. Marcus looked at him with a face still bruised and swollen from Thursday night's beating. Henderson said he expected Marcus knew why they were there. Marcus replied that he did, then told them to get it done. No point making it harder than it needed to be. He stood slowly, turned around, and put his hands behind his back. Henderson put the handcuffs on personally, while Jerome, Curtis, and Antoine surrendered without resistance. As Henderson walked Marcus to the patrol car, he couldn't help asking the question that had been eating at him since Sunday. Was it worth it? All of this death and destruction for a street corner beating. Marcus looked at his house, the place he'd bought with Brenda in 1972, where he'd raised his sons and built a life. He looked at his boys being loaded into separate cars. He looked at the August sun rising over the east side, same as it always had, and gave an answer that would haunt Henderson for years. Ask me in 20 years. By that afternoon, all 4 Williams men sat in holding cells at Wayne County Jail, facing 8 counts of first-degree murder. If convicted, they would spend the rest of their lives in prison. Life without parole was the most likely outcome in a state that had abolished the death penalty over a century earlier. But the question that haunted every person who heard this story was simple and terrible. Had Marcus Williams done the right thing? Was he a desperate father protecting his family's honor in a city that offered no other options? Or was he a mass murderer who dressed up his crimes in the language of respect and justice? Where exactly was the line between defending what's yours and becoming the very monster you claim to be fighting? When 37 people watch you get beaten and do nothing, when the only currency left is violence, when the system has completely abandoned your neighborhood, how far would any of us go? These were questions with no easy answers, no clear moral conclusions. Just the terrible knowledge that in 1987 Detroit, sometimes ordinary men were pushed to extraordinary darkness. And once you cross certain lines, there's no coming back from what you've become. The trial would come in February. The verdicts would be swift and merciless. The sentences would lock these men away for decades. But the real judgment had already been rendered in the court of public opinion, and that jury would remain forever divided on whether Marcus Williams was a hero or a monster. The only certainty was that 8 young men were dead, 4 families were destroyed, and the east side of Detroit would carry these scars forever. Some wounds never heal, Some debts can never be paid. And some nights in August are so dark that even the sunrise can't wash away what happened in the darkness. The hunt was over. The reckoning was just beginning. The trial of Marcus Anthony Williams and his 3 sons began on a bitter February morning in 1988. Snow fell steadily outside the Wayne County Courthouse in downtown Detroit, blanketing the city in white that would turn to gray slush within hours. Inside courtroom 4B, the weight of 8 deaths pressed down on everyone present like a physical force. The prosecution team arrived with briefcases full of evidence that painted a picture so clear it left no room for interpretation. Shell casings recovered from 4 different crime scenes, forensic reports linking the weapons to the Williams family, witness testimony placing them at multiple locations throughout that bloody night. A timeline so meticulously documented it read like a military operation. District Attorney Sarah Chen had built her career prosecuting violent crimes in Detroit, but even she admitted this case was different. 8 executions carried out over 6 hours with surgical precision. This wasn't a crime of passion or a drug deal gone wrong. This was premeditated revenge dressed up in the language of honor and respect. The defense attorneys looked overwhelmed from the moment jury selection began. 4 court-appointed lawyers trying to save the lives of men who'd systematically eliminated 8 people across Detroit's East Side. Their strategy centered on extreme emotional disturbance, painting Marcus as a good man driven to madness by cumulative trauma. They brought in experts on post-traumatic stress disorder, professors who testified about the psychological impact of losing a spouse to cancer, sociologists who explained the economic devastation that had destroyed Detroit's black middle class. They painted a picture of a man who'd lost everything, pushed beyond the breaking point by a system that had abandoned his neighborhood. The prosecution methodically destroyed each argument. Extreme emotional disturbance doesn't involve 2 days of planning. It doesn't include surveillance of multiple properties or waiting for victims to be isolated from witnesses. This wasn't temporary insanity. This was calculated elimination, systematic and cold. Marcus Williams sat through it all with the same stoic expression he'd worn the night of the arrests. No visible emotion, no reaction to testimony that described his actions in clinical detail. His sons showed more distress, particularly Antoine, who'd been 18 when he helped hunt men barely older than himself. The courtroom was packed every day. Families of the victims filled one side, their grief a palpable presence that seemed to permeate the air. On the other side sat supporters of the Williams family, people from the East Side who understood the code that had driven Marcus to violence. When Dwayne Harris took the stand, the tension in the room became electric. Here was the man who'd started it all with his cruel words and vicious beating. The sole survivor of a crew that had been systematically eliminated. His testimony was devastating in its detail. He described that August night when Marcus had climbed the stairs to his apartment, weapon in hand, death in his eyes. How his 3-year-old daughter had saved his life simply by appearing at the door, her innocent presence the only thing that could reach whatever humanity remained in Marcus Williams. Dwayne's voice broke when he described watching Marcus lower the weapon, seeing mercy where none had been expected. He testified not to help the prosecution, he said, but because 8 young men deserved justice, and because Marcus Williams had spared him when he didn't have to. The defense called character witnesses who painted a different picture of Marcus Williams. Vietnam veterans who spoke of his service, his Bronze Star for valor in combat. Former co-workers from the Chrysler plant who described a man who'd worked honestly for 13 years before the layoffs destroyed his livelihood. Neighbors who remembered him helping fix their cars, checking on elderly residents, keeping his sons away from the streets that claimed so many young men. But the prosecution's rebuttal was swift and merciless. Character witnesses couldn't change the fact that Marcus Williams had written 9 names in a notebook and systematically crossed off 8 of them with bullets. Good men don't plan executions. Heroes don't hunt down young men in their homes and eliminate them while they sleep. The jury deliberated for 19 hours over 3 days. 12 Detroit residents who understood the pressures of urban life but hadn't lived the specific hell of the East Side in 1987. They emerged with verdicts that surprised no one who'd followed the case. Guilty on all charges, all 4 defendants, 36 counts of first-degree murder combined. Sentencing came 3 weeks later. Marcus Anthony Williams, life without possibility of parole. Jerome Williams, life without parole. Curtis Williams, 40 years to life. Antoine Williams, 35 years to life. His youth the only factor that saved him from dying behind bars. When Judge Patricia Morrison read the sentences, Marcus Williams showed no emotion. No tears, no shock, no protest. Just a slight nod, as if he'd known from the moment he pulled that first trigger exactly where this path would lead. The only flicker of feeling came when Martha Williams was escorted from the courtroom, their eyes meeting one final time across a chasm that could never be bridged. The aftermath rippled through Detroit like waves from a stone thrown into still water. The East Side changed in ways both subtle and profound. For several years, street violence actually decreased as crews became more cautious about pushing desperate men too far. Nobody wanted to be the next Marcus Williams or the next group to trigger such methodical revenge. Community organizations held meetings about conflict resolution, about alternatives to violence, about the importance of respect without bloodshed. Churches filled on Sundays as people sought meaning in tragedy that seemed to have no clear moral lesson. But the change wasn't permanent. Within 5 years, new people had moved into the neighborhood who didn't know the story. New crews formed who hadn't learned the lessons written in blood across 8 crime scenes. The crack epidemic peaked in the early 90s, bringing violence that made the Williams massacre seem almost quaint by comparison. Human nature being what it is, the lessons faded. The specific details became legend, then myth, then cautionary tale told to warn against pushing ordinary people past their breaking point. Marcus Williams served 27 years in Kinross Correctional Facility in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. He worked in the prison library, helping other inmates prepare for their GED exams. Guards said he was one of the most disciplined prisoners they'd ever known, never seeking trouble, earning respect even from hardened criminals through sheer presence and an unspoken code of honor that translated behind bars. In 2003, at age 59, Marcus became an ordained minister through a prison correspondence program. He started leading Sunday services in the chapel, counseling younger inmates about violence, about choices, about the weight you carry when you cross lines that can't be uncrossed. Some of those young men listened, most didn't. Every year on August 16th, Marcus wrote letters to the families of the victims. Most went unanswered. A few were returned unopened. But Gloria Thompson, Kevin's mother, wrote back once in 2005. Her words were both forgiveness and condemnation. Your apologies don't bring my son back. Your prayers don't erase what you did. But I forgive you anyway, because carrying hate for 18 years has already destroyed too much of my life. Marcus kept that letter in his cell until the day he died. On November 3rd, 2015, exactly 30 years after Brenda's death, Marcus Williams suffered a massive stroke during morning count. He died in the prison infirmary at 6:42 in the morning, 71 years old. The chaplain reported that his last coherent words were a message for his sons and his dead wife. Tell them I'm sorry. Tell Brenda I tried to protect them. Tell her I'm sorry I failed. Jerome Williams remains incarcerated at Ionia Correctional Facility. He's 61 now, parole denied repeatedly over the decades. He obtained his bachelor's degree through correspondence courses and works as a teaching assistant in the prison education program. In a rare interview with a criminology student, he reflected on that night with the weight of decades. My father taught us to protect family at any cost. That night, the cost was 8 lives and our freedom. Some lessons you learn too late. Curtis Williams was paroled in 2018 after serving 30 years. He lives quietly in a halfway house, works at a car wash, attends therapy twice a week. He hasn't spoken to Jerome since 2009, couldn't reconcile what they'd done together. In the few interviews he's granted, Curtis speaks carefully about that August night. I was 21, thought I was protecting my father. Now I'm 56 and I still see their faces every night. Those images don't fade, they just become part of who you are. Antoine Williams struggled most with incarceration. Multiple suicide attempts in the first 5 years, psychiatric medications, solitary confinement for his own protection. He found religion in 1995 and became a different person entirely. Paroled in 2012 at age 43, he moved to Chicago, changed his name legally, and now works as a youth counselor, trying to keep young men away from the streets that destroyed his family. The victims' families carried their own weight through the decades. Gloria Thompson never fully recovered from losing her son. She raised Kevin's daughter alone after the child's mother proved unable to cope with the trauma. Gloria died in 2004 of heart failure, though people who knew her said it was really a broken heart that finally gave out after 17 years. Miss Evelyn Lewis sold her house and moved away from Mulellen Street in 1989. She couldn't walk past the corner where they'd found Brandon's body. She lived quietly until her death in 2011 at age 95, never speaking about the massacre when reporters found her on anniversaries. Terence Mitchell's mother, Barbara, became an anti-violence activist, speaking at schools and community centres, founding a non-profit called Stop the Cycle. She's 78 now, still running the organisation, still fighting the same battles. Her message is complex and nuanced. Marcus Williams destroyed 8 families that night, but the system destroyed Marcus first. Both things are true. We can condemn what he did while understanding what drove him to it. Dwayne Harris kept his word about testifying, then disappeared from Detroit in 1989. He moved to Atlanta, started a legitimate auto repair business, changed his life completely. He's 64 now, remarried with 5 children including Jasmine, who works as an elementary school teacher. She knows what happened, knows her father's crew was eliminated, knows Marcus Williams spared her father because of her presence. In a gesture that speaks to the complexity of human nature, Jasmine named her own daughter Brenda after Marcus Williams's wife. A complicated tribute to a man who killed 8 people but couldn't kill one more in front of a child. The story of the Williams family became a cautionary tale told across urban America. Don't push a desperate man. Don't humiliate a father in public. Don't underestimate what ordinary people will do when they have nothing left to lose, and the system offers no protection. Detective William Henderson retired in 2010 after 44 years with Detroit police. In a podcast interview about the case years later, he offered a reflection that captures the moral complexity. Legally, Marcus Williams was a mass murderer who deserved every day of his life sentence. Morally, he was a desperate father in a broken city where the system had completely failed. The law says one thing, the streets say another. That contradiction is something I've had to live with every day since 1987. The uncomfortable truth is that both assessments can be simultaneously correct. Marcus Williams was a murderer who eliminated 8 people with premeditation and planning. He was also a desperate father driven to extremes by circumstances that would have broken most men. The most disturbing aspect of this story isn't the violence itself, but how it forces us to confront questions we'd rather avoid. What would we do if someone stole not just our possessions, but our dignity, our respect, the only inheritance we had to pass to our children? How far would we go to protect what defines us when the system has completely failed to recognize or protect what we value most? There are no easy answers, no clear moral conclusions, no satisfying resolution where good triumphs and evil is punished. Just the simple and terrible truth that violence breeds more violence, that broken systems create their own monsters, and that sometimes the line between justice and revenge becomes so thin it disappears entirely. 47 years have passed since that August night on Detroit's East Side. The city hasn't healed so much as evolved, adapted, found new ways to struggle with the same fundamental problems. Every year, families face impossible choices when systems fail them. Every year, some choose violence. The house on Mulellen Street where Marcus Williams raised his sons was foreclosed in 1989 and sold to a new family in 1995. They knew nothing of its history. Their children play in the yard where Marcus sat that last night before the massacre, cleaning weapons and making peace with what he was about to become. Kevin Thompson's mother's house on Chalmers Street still stands, occupied by a different family who repainted the porch where Kevin fell. But neighbours say that on quiet nights, you can still feel the weight of what happened there. The corner of Grasset and Fairmount where Marcus was beaten looks like any other Detroit street corner. Liquor store with security bars, cracked sidewalk, no memorial or plaque. The city moved on as cities do, covering scars with layers of normalcy until they almost disappear. But they never completely disappear. The wounds remain, hidden beneath the surface, waiting for the right pressure, the right humiliation, the right combination of desperation and rage to tear them open again. Revenge doesn't bring back the dead. It doesn't heal wounds or restore lost dignity. It only creates new dead, new wounds, new families, learning to live with holes where love used to be. Marcus Williams defended his family's honor, but lost his soul in the process. He eliminated 8 threats, but created 8 shattered families. He won a battle for respect, but lost the war against his own humanity. In the end, he died surrounded by prison guards instead of the sons he'd tried to protect, carrying to his grave the weight of choices that had seemed so clear on that August night, but had proven to be anything but simple. The question that remains, the one each of us must answer for ourselves, is both simple and terrible. When the system fails, when no one helps, when respect is all you have left, how far would you go? Where do you draw the line? And once you cross it, can you ever truly come back? The Detroit vengeance of 1987 stands as one of the most chilling examples of what happens when ordinary people are pushed beyond their breaking point in a city that forgot how to protect its own. Marcus Williams was both a devoted father and a methodical killer. His victims were both street criminals and young men trying to survive in an economy that offered them few choices. These contradictions don't resolve into neat moral categories, and that's what makes this story so deeply unsettling. What began with a 3-minute beating on a street corner spiraled into 8 executions that destroyed dozens of lives and left scars on Detroit's east side that remain visible today. The code of respect that governed those streets demanded a response to humiliation, but the price of that response proved far higher than anyone could have imagined. Marcus Williams got his wedding ring back and preserved his family's honor, but he lost his sons to prison, his own life to decades behind bars, and whatever remained of his soul to the darkness he embraced that August night. The young men who died weren't monsters, just products of a broken system trying to survive the only way their world allowed. This story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about justice, family loyalty, and the thin line between protecting what we love and becoming something unrecognizable. In neighborhoods where the system has failed completely, where 37 people can watch a man get beaten and do nothing, that line becomes harder to see and easier to cross. The Williams family's hunt through Detroit's streets reminds us that every person has a breaking point. Every family has something they value more than life itself. And sometimes, when you push desperate people too far in places where law and order have collapsed, the result is a kind of justice so dark and terrible that it destroys everyone it touches.